Well, welcome back to our final message video. I started recording these videos a little over a year ago with the COVID-19 shutdown and did it for that reason. And then even in August, when the church began meeting with outdoor services, I continued to record these and upload them to YouTube because not everyone could come to our outdoor services. And plus, friends from different parts of the country and actually a couple of people in other countries were watching these. And so I've had fun doing them. I appreciate the feedback I've gotten from many of you. But starting next week, we will move our worship service back inside the building. And so I've decided that this would be the end of these video messages. Thank you for those of you who faithfully watch these every week. And as I said, I appreciated the feedback I've received from you. Also, I want to say thank you to those of you who have financially supported the church during this shutdown period. We have been able to meet all of our financial obligations during this year, and that's wonderful. And so many people have mailed in checks. Some have used our electronic giving that you find on our website. And so thank you for that. We're still, getting by week financially. We're hoping that's going to pick up pretty soon. But we really do appreciate that. For this final message, last week concluded a series that I've been sharing since the week after Easter about Jesus' resurrection appearances and the things that he taught the disciples even after his death, burial, and resurrection. And then last week was Pentecost Sunday, and so we concluded that series. Today is just a one-time message. It's kind of a follow-up to what happened next. Now, you might remember in the first message of that previous series, one of the questions I asked that I thought would be on the minds of the disciples is, where do we go from here? Jesus was their rabbi, meaning their teacher. He was the one who guided them. He was the one who said, I'm going to make you a person who will catch people instead of fish. And what does that mean? And so during the resurrection appearances, he continued to teach them. And now they're in a place of, where do we go next? What do we do from here? And so we're going to look a little bit at that. What happened with the church from the day of Pentecost forward? Now we know 3,000 people became Christians on that day. But the church continued to grow and develop. Some people followed the idea of going. Jesus said, go into all the world. And the question about that has always been, was that an imperative verb, a command meaning go, or is that a participle, as you go? And when my friend Larry Bubb spoke on my behalf one Sunday, he tackled that and talked about the idea of sharing Jesus as you go. Now, for some people, that's something they go someplace and do that. Some of the disciples did that. Today, we have people who do that. In fact, we have a good friend named Jennifer who followed that command and became a missionary to Great Britain. You don't normally think about that country as a place that needs missionaries, but that's where her call was. Now, as they developed, though, they began gaining different monikers. They were called the disciples. They were called the Way. Finally, in Antioch, there's a little phrase in the book of Acts. They were first called Christians at Antioch. So that became one of the monikers, one of the names by which these disciples became known. Now, it's interesting that today Christian is a very popular term, but it's used very rarely in the New Testament. In fact, besides that usage identifying that Antioch was the first place that term was used. It's only used 2 other times, and one is in Acts 26:28. Then King Agrippa said to Paul, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian?" And then Peter used it in one of his epistles just one time in First Peter chapter 4, verse 16. "However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name." Now, through the years, the question has been, they were first called Christians. Well, who called them that? And I've heard some colleagues who believe that it was God who gave them that name and explain in detail about why that's a divine name given by God. Other scholars, though, think that it was something given to them by the people of Antioch. And of course, it's from a Greek word, the language from which the name originates. The word originally Christos for Christ. It's the Greek title for Messiah, means anointed one. An ending was added to it, making it Christianoi, and the verb that's used with it means to transact business. So the indication seems to be that they were called Christians because they were about doing the business of Jesus, and that was their focus. Pretty interesting stuff, I think. But they began experiencing change as they moved along. Remember, all of the first Christians were all Jewish. And so they found themselves in that struggle between, do I continue practicing Judaism as I knew it, as I grew up with it, or are new things coming along? And it's, it's kind of interesting because they began applying Jesus' words. And on one occasion, Jesus was asked a question about the commandments, the 10 commandments. And he was asked, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And it could be that the question wasn't just about the 10 commandments, but about all of the different commandments that are found within the law. And you go back and you read, especially Leviticus and Deuteronomy, there are lots of laws for them to follow. And Jesus' reply was, first of all, he quoted Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it." And in the second one, he quotes Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. "Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments." That's a big statement. All the law, all the prophets hang on these 2. That you would love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and you would love your neighbor as yourself. And I'm sure that part of what happened with the early church is what happens now. To be able to work out those words, to understand what does that mean on a daily basis. How do I love the Lord my God with all my heart, with all my soul, with my mind, with everything that I am? And then how do I love my neighbor as myself? How do I love my neighbor as myself? And of course, they looked at how could they care for one another. And there are several very famous passages in Acts which show them caring for one another. One I read last week. I'll read it again this week. At the end of chapter 2, they, meaning those people who had become Christians, those disciples, those people who were part of the way, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. So they were together learning more from the apostles. They were encouraging one another. They were sharing meals together. And they were praying. And everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and miraculous signs done by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. So they were taking care of one another in practical ways. And so as they began thinking about Jesus' words, what does it mean to love my neighbor? That's what they were deciding. How can I love my neighbor? So they were taking practical care of one another. They were together learning more about what it means to be a Christian. It's amazing stuff. I've been thinking about what Jesus said, to love my neighbor as myself, especially during this COVID shutdown time. What would it mean to love my neighbor? And not long after the shutdown, I noticed one day that the Salvation Army delivered a box of food to our neighbor across the street. And I told Pam about it, and I wondered, well, maybe they're having a tough time getting food. And of course, that was during a time that people were hoarding food, so the grocery store shelves were empty. And so Pam and I discussed it, and we thought, well, one of us should find a way just to ask them. We didn't want to embarrass them. But a couple days later, Pam saw Tony, the neighbor who lived there with his wife, and she said, hey, we noticed the Salvation Army delivering food. Do you guys need help with anything? We'd be glad to help out if we could. And he started laughing. He said, oh, no, that's free food the Salvation Army gives you. I'm just storing it up for the apocalypse. We tried to help, didn't have to. But, there were other ways. For me, as I applied this, and not everybody believes this, but for me, loving my neighbor during COVID was doing my best to make sure that I didn't get COVID-19, that my family didn't, and that we didn't transmit it to anyone else. And I took it very seriously right from the start. And so wearing a mask, practicing social distance. As soon as I could get a vaccine, I got one. I was even tested for COVID-19 at one time and tested negative, which was a positive thing. But for me, that's part of loving your neighbor when there's something this serious. And it's important to think about those kinds of things. No matter what your setting is, how is it that you can love your neighbor as yourself? This is all important stuff. And the church had to, day by day, struggle with what that meant. What does it mean to follow the words of Jesus? What does it mean to be the church? Where do we go from here? And you look at the history of the church now, and you see just amazing accomplishments through the years. That the church became more than just a small fellowship of people sharing meals in their homes. That through the years, the church has, of course, we've got lots of denominations, and some people think that's a good thing. Some people think it's a bad thing. I don't mind that. I like the variety of the denominations. But through the years, think about it. The church has started hospitals. We've started universities. We've started feeding programs. When the AIDS crisis hit, many churches began looking for ways to take care of those who were suffering from AIDS. And then with COVID-19, many churches have found ways to try to help and encourage in this crisis as well. So the church, as it tries to live out the words of Jesus, has found ways through the centuries of being the church. So where do we go from here? What will happen next with Winchester Community United Methodist Church? For those of you who are watching this in other parts of the country, what will happen next with you and your church? Because I believe God is always ready to do something new, and that it's important for the church to seek out Where do we go from here? What's next? Let's look for those new things to start. Let's look for those new ways to love my neighbor. Let's look for those new ways to worship the Lord our God. Who are the beloved? Go and be the beloved.